The gladiatorial games originated in the Roman Republic as funeral games. The word gladiator comes from the Latin word gladius, which means a sword. And in Book 5 of Virgil's Aeneid, you will be reading about an example of such funeral games. In Book 5 of the Aeneid, Aeneas, the great hero of Roman history, pre-Roman history, holds these games in honor of his father, Anchises. We're not reading it. We're reading books 5, 6, 7, and 12 for our class this week. At the end of book 3, Anchises, Aeneas' father, whom he carries out of the burning city of Troy on his shoulders, while Aeneas has his young son Ascanius at his side, holding his hand, and his wife Creusa following behind. This idea of Aeneas, carrying his father Anchises on his shoulders, leaving the burning city of Troy, is often seen as an emblem of Aeneas carrying his history, his past with him. At the end of book 3, Anchises dies quietly in just a couple of lines, and in book 4, as we know from reading it, Aeneas ends up in Carthage, falls in love with the queen Dido, a romance that ends tragically with Dido killing herself, and Aeneas leaving as the will of the gods tells him to continue his journey to Italy to eventually to found what will be the Roman race. In book 5, he holds the funeral games, and again, such funeral games are really the origin of the gladiatorial games. In book 5 of the Aeneid, they involve a ship race, a foot race, and a archery contest. They are not to the death at all, but again, in honor of the dead. Interestingly, in book 6, which is really one of the most famous and glorious books of the Aeneid, Aeneas goes down to the underworld, a katabasis. I believe we've seen this term before, sometimes spelled with a K. When we talked about the Odyssey, Odysseus goes down to the underworld, to Hades, and we talked about that in terms of, oh, brother, where art thou? In terms of, what scenes in that movie seem like a trip to the underworld, a trip to darkness, an encounter with the dead. In Aeneas' case, his trip to the underworld results in him encountering a couple of people from his past, including some Greeks, and also including Anchises, who gives a famous prophecy about the glory and the grandeur of Rome, who predicts, in other words, the greatness that will be what we know as the Roman Empire. In book 7, books 7 through 12, we'll see Aeneas go to Italy, and after a first attempt to have a peaceful treaty with the King der Latinus, unfortunately, Juno, working behind the scenes, Juno, the wife of Zeus, the queen of the gods, stirs up a lot of trouble for Aeneas, and he ends up having to fight and battle with the native Italians under their leader, whose name is Turnus, for the rest of the 6 books of the Aeneid, and until the end. We do know that Aeneas will be victorious. Zeus says so, the prophecy says so. We see Aeneas go to the underworld, and his father tells him it will be so. So those events in books, the last part of this last 6 books of the Aeneid are somewhat overshadowed by the history that we know to be true. But there were many moments when Virgil, gives the sense that maybe Aeneas will not be able to fulfill his destiny, just as Dido stood in his way in book 4, Turnus and the native Italians who he has to fight with due to. Well, this is a prehistory of Rome. We do not have his, archaeological evidence for Aeneas. He's a legendary figure. You could compare him to George Washington, except that George Washington was a real person who did real things. You can see the places where he fought. You can see his teeth, right? You can't see that for Aeneas. He's a legendary hero. And Virgil wrote about Aeneas in, again, the Aeneid, his last great work. Virgil living from 70 to 19 BCE, before the Common Era. And Virgil, the author of, again, the Eclogues, a series of pastoral poems about poetry and and the Shepherds, the Georgics, a wonderful didactic poem about agriculture, really a celebration, though, of Rome. Virgil started the Georgics around 37 BCE. They came out in 29 BCE. As we know, the Battle of Actium occurred in around in the 30s BC, and we know that by about 27 BCE, Augustus had established himself as the emperor. Now, this is around the time the Georgics comes out, the Aeneid comes out. The Aeneid was not finished at the time of Virgil's death, which occurred in Brundisium. Virgil died of some kind of fever that he had contracted from traveling back from Greece. And Virgil apparently wanted the Aeneid burned. And one reason I want you to read the last book of the Aeneid is because scholars debate, was this the ending that Virgil really wanted? We've talked a lot about heroes over the course of this class. And Aeneas, the sort of patron, the founding hero of the Romans, in the first 6 books of the Aeneid, I think it could be said that he shows a lot of characteristics of a tragic hero. He's got flaws. He keeps wavering from his destiny. He falls in love with Dido. I mean, you could say, yes, the gods make him do it. He gets shot by the arrow from Cupid, but he does fall in love. He does waver in his journey. In the last books, in the last 6 books of the Aeneid, some pointed out that Aeneas is he's a little bit like Spartacus, I would say. He seems a little bit flawless. He has a mission and he carries it out. But take a really close look at the very ending of the Aeneid, where Aeneas suddenly, in a rush of emotion, does something that perhaps, he's human. And Virgil makes him a human hero, I think. Virgil wanted his poem burned. It wasn't burned because the Emperor Augustus stepped in, because the executors of Virgil's will chose not to do so. And of course, we have the Aeneid to read. It is a tour de force of epic poetry, but also Roman history. Keeping in mind that, of course, it's not exactly about Roman history. Virgil tries to make a claim that, Ascanius, who is Aeneas' son, is an ancestor of Julius Caesar, because Ascanius, lo and behold, has another name. He has an alternate name of Iulus, which, as Virgil points out, looks so much like Iulius, which is the Latin spelling, the Iulius, with this I, of Julius Caesar. So, Virgil's not worried about being historically accurate. Keep this in mind, when you're thinking about this poem that has been read for centuries, that was, also read during the Christian Middle Ages. Virgil was considered, perhaps, a pagan, but still one who must be attended to, must be read. In Dante's Inferno, of course, he is the guide for Dante through the underworld, and also the Inferno, and also through Purgatory. Gladiator, a film in 2000 about gladiators that makes, you could say, mincemeat of history. From the beginning, the gladiators suggest, and it suggests an end to a Roman emperor, a death, Marcus Aurelius, who died in 180 AD or CE, Common Era. It suggests that Marcus Aurelius was smothered by his own son, who becomes the Emperor Commodus. It creates a totally fictional character, Maximus, played by Russell Crowe, a Roman general who Marcus Aurelius, according to the movie, wants to have him, step into his place. Commodus is jealous. Maximus, because he won't agree to be loyal to Commodus, ends up, his wife and his son are crucified. By the time Maximus gets back to see them, they're dead. Maximus is supposed to be from Spain. He gets captured. He ends up being sent to a gladiatorial school. He becomes a gladiator, fighting great feats. He ends up back in Rome, and then all kinds of other events happen, all of which are sort of based on historical characters, but put into a huge, interesting mix of events that made a movie that a lot of people really wanted to see, with a soundtrack that a lot of people bought. So this is a really popular movie. I would say it's as popular as, maybe it's almost as popular as the Aeneid. You know, the Aeneid's lasted for a long time. I don't know if Gladiator will, but hey, the Aeneid's been around. People still read the Aeneid. Will we still watch Gladiator after 2,000 years? But one thing to keep in mind is that people really liked watching Gladiator. It's got a gripping story. It's got, you know, I would say it's got an amazing gladiator show, in a Roman Colosseum, which, if you'll read, is a sort of a half-created structure, and part of it is computer-generated, because since we are talking about a movie in 2000, we now have computer technological resources that can enable directors to create sets that look like Rome, but they don't actually have to go to the cost of building an actual set. Whereas, of course, in a movie like Spartacus and Cleopatra, we know how much money at the time was spent to actually build Cleopatra's barge. Spartacus was filmed in Spain. So, there's something about the spectacle, you know, of Gladiator that I think appeals to audiences. You know, there's, you know, something about watching the movie. Keep in mind that the love of such spectacle and of watching games and athletic contests was something that was very much the case for the Romans. Gladiatorial games may have originated as funeral games, but they become an incredibly, a huge source of popular entertainment among the Romans. And Julius Caesar, for instance, well, before he became the Julius Caesar as we know him, and he was campaigning to win the favor, shall you say, of the Roman people, he would hold immense gladiatorial games to get to get people's attention and their approval. And, you know, the gladiatorial games, of course, become an established sort of fixture in Roman society, with gladiators winning, you know, great, followings of their own, with, you know, people talking about spending their whole days at the games. The gladiatorial shows were a fixture, you could say, of the Roman life, certainly in the Roman Empire. The Roman poet Ovid writes about, you know, what you should do when you go to the games to make sure you sit next to the girl that you might be having a bit of an interest in, for instance. So, you know, I think that one thing to keep in mind, you know, in any kind of, you know, critique of the movie Gladiator, because there are, again, many historical inaccuracies in it. It's not trying, I think, to be a historically accurate movie. You know, there are also famous things about the movie, like the fact that someone's wearing a wristwatch in it that you can see. So, on the other hand, Gladiator shows how the ancient world inspires us to create stories that people really, really get into for whatever reason. Something about the ancient world combined with imagination can often create a really, really powerful piece of work that people want to see, that perhaps inspires, that creates interesting protagonists who are not perfect, who have flaws, but flaws, as we saw in the movie protagonists, can often make a hero interesting, can give him well-rounded edges, can make him into someone who's not preaching to us, but someone who, even though he's a hero doing things that we can't do, we can see a little bit of ourselves in. So, as you're watching Gladiator, you know, think about the fact that, you know, this is a movie that, yeah, it is, as one Roman historian says, represents the best of times and the worst of times for the study of ancient history. It's the worst of times because the movie isn't accurate. It's not a film that one should perhaps use to teach Roman history, but it's the best of times. It's a great thing to get people interested in the ancient world, and if it makes them go back to studying the actual ancient world, to reading Virgil with his version of Roman prehistory, to reading a Roman historian like Tacitus or Sallust or Livy, that's a really great thing. Sometimes the past, you know, in its reality, maybe doesn't always inspire us, but something that gets us to look at the past and think about it and imagine what it could have been like to live 2,000 years ago. That's a worthwhile thing.